guys, I'm MTG Ducky, and today we're going to look at an EDH deck that I've come to enjoy. It's a budget build, tribal themed, EDH, and I'm happy to share it with you guys. This is Krenko, Mob Boss. Let's begin, shall we? Krenko, Mob Boss, costs 2 colorless and 2 red mana. He has 3 power and 3 toughness, and a single relevant ability. Like most organizations, criminal or otherwise, you need to start at the ground floor. Think of Krenko as your PR and human resources departments combined. Every turn, he's out of the command zone. He's working hard to bring you those skilled workers you so desperately need, only those skilled workers are nose-picking, half-witted goblin lackeys working for less than minimum wage. Krenko's ability reads as such. Tap Krenko, then put X 1/1 red goblin creatures onto the battlefield, where X is how many goblins you control. Pretty straightforward, right? Right off the bat, it's pretty clear that Krenko wants to be built around a tribal theme, specifically goblins. Part of the reason this deck is great for people to start with is because single-colored decks, and often tribal decks, barring merfolk, can be very affordable, straightforward, and a lot of fun to play. You don't need to break the bank on land, since playing just mountains is often enough. There are hundreds of goblin cards to choose from, so you can avoid the overly pricey modern or legacy staples. Lastly, you can build the deck to be combo-based and aggro-based, while not feeling like you are playing two badly mashed together decks. Alright, so it's the first few turns. Normally this is when people are ramping, fixing their mana, and building up some small defensive. Since we are playing mono red, we don't need to guarantee having certain colors beyond red, but a lot of our ramping will come in the form of artifacts. You're going to want to keep an opening hand with at least 3 lands and 1 mana rock. It doesn't matter which, really. The ones I would recommend running are Soul Ring, Mind Stone, Fire Diamond, and to a lesser extent, Ruby Medallion. You'll also want to make sure you have 1 or 2 cheap goblin creatures or spells. Mogwar Marshal, Krenko's Command, and Dragon Fodder fill this role nicely. They provide us with 2 bodies that Krenko wants to have already on the field when he hits. Lastly, you're going to want to make sure you have a haste enabler before you cast Krenko. There's nothing worse than casting Krenko and then having an opponent kill him before you get to tap him due to summoning sickness. The extra cost of recasting him can really set us back tempo-wise. Make sure you can cast Fervor, Hammer of Perforos, or Ashling's Prerogative before Krenko comes to town. By now, you've built up a small army. Like any good mob, you've got to have your trusty lieutenants. Thankfully, since some of the earliest sets, goblins have had some of the best lore-type cards in Magic. Goblin King, Goblin Chieftain, and Goblin War Chief each provide unique bonuses to our little army. King and Chieftain pump our little 1/1s by giving them +1/+1, while Chieftain and War Chief provide all of our goblins with haste. You can also consider the Colorless Lord, Adaptive Automaton, if you want to maximize on your lords. You'll also want to start gearing your little angry red men up by casting strong artifacts like Coat of Arms, Door of Destinies, or relevant enchantments like Shared Animosity. These will make our seemingly weak 1/1s into enormous beaters, relying on their strength of numbers to boost their power and toughness. You should start attacking opponents by this point, but don't focus on one person alone. You might want to consider not going crazy with Krenko's ability unless you can guarantee a win. If you overextend your board too much, you will have to start over once someone casts a board wipe. Depending on what you still have left on the field, it can be slow to build up your criminal empire again. Late game for us is often a few turns earlier than most other decks. Red is an aggressive color, and we often commit hard to our game plan. Being stalled by missed land drops, having to start over from a board wipe, or having key creatures removed can be the difference between winning on turn 5 or 6 and not winning at all. After turn 3 or 4, basically whichever turn you cast Krenko on, you're going to want to start getting ready to finish the game. People are not going to tolerate you making 2, then 4, then 8, and so on goblins until you get out of hand. So before they get killed, you need to guarantee that those little darlings will do damage in one form or another. Cards like Perforos, God of the Forge, and Impact Tremors make sure that even if the goblin tokens can't swing, they're still dealing damage. Goblin Warstrike and Burn at the Stake are also spells that don't require your creatures to attack. They just care that you have a truckload of goblins out on the field. Goblin Bombardment can also do some heavy lifting in the deck, acting as either creature removal or player damage at the expense of sacrificing our goblins. Just imagine it. It's as if we're throwing our little goblins right in their faces. Finally, you can always run Voracious Dragon. I know that it took us time to build up our little army, and the idea of them being devoured by this giant lizard is really upsetting. But this one card can pull a win out from nowhere. Dealing damage based on how many creatures it devoured, and doubling that damage if they were goblins, Voracious Dragon is a great backup win condition. Now that you've got an idea for how the game will go, let's look at a few cards that can really shine in a Krenko Mob Boss EDH deck. First, let's look at a few sacrifice outlets. Goblin Chirurgeon can provide us with a means to protect Krenko from dying, something which I mentioned earlier as a huge no-no to our master death-bringing plan. Skirk Prospector will give you significant ramp if you have an active Krenko out on the field. If you combine Skirk with an untapped Krenko, at least 3 other goblins, and an artifact like Thornbite Staff, you can make infinite mana or goblin tokens for the win. Ashnod's Altar functions similarly to Skirk Prospector, or as I like to call him, Captain Skirk. Only it provides us with 2 colorless mana instead of the 1 red mana. The extra mana is nice, but keep in mind sometimes you just really want the red mana more. For tutors, the deck runs about 3 or 4, depending on your budget. Goblin Matron, as I sometimes like to call myself, is a very powerful card for this deck. She allows us to find any goblin from our deck and put it in our hand. Goblin Recruiter can be such a strong card that it is banned in French Dual Commander. That alone should tell you how good he can be. Functioning similarly to Matron, Recruiter allows us to take any number of goblin creature cards and put them in any order on top of our deck. Mogcatcher is one of the more expensive tutors for the deck, but they bring the goblin we want directly to the field. You can also run Gamble, although the cost and randomness of the card can often be a huge deterrent. You're also going to want to run some card draw. Red doesn't do card draw very well, so oftentimes it comes with a bit of a backlash. Wheel of Fate and Reforge the Souls fills our hands back up to 7. Woohoo! But at the cost of discarding our pre-existing hand. Oh. And it also does the same thing for our opponents. These can be tricky cards, since if you know an opponent has a sculpted hand, it can be backbreaking. But it can also get rid of their dead hands and give them tons of playables. Keeping these pros and cons in mind, be careful when you use them. Well everyone, that's my take on how to play Krenko Mob Boss in EDH. I hope you enjoyed this collaboration, and please be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Bis bald!